How English is taught has always been a subject of great controversy and strong opinion. Teachers TV has brought together a small group of people intimately concerned with English in the classroom to discuss the current challenges and their hopes for the future. The panellists are Adrian Barlow, Senior Examiner.
We need a complete reversal of the situation.
Barbara Blyman from the English and Media Centre.
All too often we see creativity as one side of a dichotomy.
Mark Reed from the British Film Institute.
It's something I feel, deracinated middle-class white bloke, I don't feel as though I have a cultural heritage.
Jamila Gavin, children's author.
There has to be a certain qualitative judgment made.
Sabrina Broadbent, teacher and novelist.
There is too much sort of poured into the bag called English.
And the writer and broadcaster, Michael Rosen.
The sole purpose of it is to grade the nation.
The panel is chaired by Bethan Marshall, lecturer in English in Education.
Their fascination with language is endless.
The first part of the conversation focused on creativity and inspiration in the classroom. To begin with, they looked at what being good at English really means.
Michael, what does it mean to be good at English?
I think if you're good at English, you're very good at asking questions. That's what I would think about a kid or a school student or whoever. If they were asking really interesting questions about any text of any kind, then they were good at English.
OK, Mark.
Wrong question is my answer. I think we've become too obsessed with being good at stuff, but being good at things in English. If you have a different set of questions about what you might do in English, which is how can you inquire, how can you, and how might you be able to play, and what kind of experiences do you think children should have?
Being good at English basically means being able to pass as endless tests and to tick boxes against little clusters of discrete skills.
I'm concerned that the term English is put into a box as though it's just an isolated subject on its own, at which you are good, quite good or poor. And for me, English is the basic tool. Language is the basic tool for articulacy, for coherent thinking.
Every child is different, and English is a subject which should be stressing individuality. And that's what I think is important about the subject.
I think one of the things that perhaps people haven't mentioned so far is the idea of independence, developing independent learners. And that comes through literature, it comes through inventive language work, it comes through looking at the media and so forth.
Mark, what would you say that the sort of text and technologies, which is a kind of new way of looking at English?
What I think that technology is offering, new technology in particular, offering the opportunities to do, is to change what our notion of texts are and how we might engage with them. And one of the things that I think technology is enabling us to do is to play with texts. People are getting very excited about video games, computer games, and what they can teach us about learning. I've seen them called texts, and I think that completely misrepresents what a video game is. It's a game, it's not a text. But if you can call a video game a text, then why can't you take a text and call it a game? Why can't you play with a text? So something like Cartouche turns Shakespeare into a game, essentially. It kind of brings out the gaminess of language play and language behaviour, make it playful.
I think teachers do that, but actually most schools are still working kind of with one hand tied behind their back, most teachers, when it comes to having access to the right kind of technology.
We know it ends up very often in the wrong, not in the wrong hands, but it ends up in very particular places in ICT departments, and it's not really explored for its interactivity.
You don't think we've got too fixated, though, with the idea, if you talk about the future of English, that somehow or other this means a technological fix, you know what I mean?
Instead of saying, how are we going to use this technology, that's the wrong way round. It's how are we going to play, how are we going to inquire, what kind of experiences do we want children to have, what have we got to make that happen?
Do you think that assessment and testing are some of the main things that actually prevent us from doing the kinds of things that Mark is talking about?
I think that testing and assessment has become the be-all and end-all. And you might be surprised to hear me as an examiner say that, but I do think that most examiners are seriously worried about the way in which examining has dominated curriculum. What we're not very good at measuring are children's responsiveness, their creativity, and the whole range of activities that are important in the classroom. It worries me too that there is a public perception that coursework means nothing but cheating and plagiarism, because I think as far as English is concerned, in the broadest sense, coursework is very important.
You go through this course and you're just always answerable to other people and never to yourself. You also have no idea that the most important thing really is that somehow or other you have a grasp of what it is that you're learning, why you're learning it. I mean, you can't help coming to the conclusion that the sole purpose of it is to grade the nation. That's actually what's going on.
And English is far too important to just take a top strata of grading and that these are the best. I mean, everybody has got to have access to English. It's got to be relevant to everybody. You can't produce a society where only a certain category of people are deemed to be good at English and everybody else is somehow inferior. You've got to legitimise and help everybody to find their articulacy.
And if you do accept there has to be some kind of external system of assessment, then why not go for something where you sample a small amount of what you do with pupils and you allow the rest of the course, the rest of their experiences to be wide open and experimental and playful and all of those things, rather than ending up with a system where everything is kind of very rigidly geared towards that final test.
If you look at the questions that are on the SATS papers in particular, they are obsessed with the notion that a text offers up facts. So any notion of a response to a text to do with feeling, or indeed, as Mark is saying, that you can play with the text and through the text, through that play, you will find out things, is completely missing. This then dominates how the thing is taught. But it's what I've called spurious facticity. That isn't what story and literature is about.
I agree there is something wrong with what we've got in secondary school, but in primary school there has been a revolution in the teaching and the learning of what goes on there. And actually, of course, the tests are, you know, bizarre, Kafkaesque, the results are wild and meaningless, but actually the curriculum in the primary school now, and the National Literacy Strategy, I have to say, has done a kind of a pretty amazing job.
One snag though, because as a consequence of the testing, you only have to go into a Year 6 classroom over and over again across the country, and you find that the kids haven't read a whole book. Yes. What they've read is torn up texts.
This actually leads very neatly on to thinking about the whole issue of set text, canonical text and things like that. What's your view on this, Barbara?
I think what I would be arguing for is to get away from the idea that we have to have particular named authors, particular texts, but to think what's the kind of entitlement of pupils to particular sorts of experiences. For instance, you know, do we really want every child in the land to be studying Shakespeare by reading one scene and going through it in huge amounts of detail for a test? No, I don't think we do, but we might say that we think that students should have an entitlement to studying Shakespeare as a piece of performance, as a kind of living thing.
There seems to be a lack of narrative throughout the curriculum, it seems to me. I mean, history and geography and so on, they all seem to be taught in these sort of boxes and as extracts, so that there's no overall narrative, whether it's within English language itself or within the whole curriculum.
I mean,
partly because the narrative is heavily contested.
If you don't give them their greens, then when you've got them, you're trusting them going out into the outside world where they might just pick it up serendipitously, if that's such a word.
Most English teachers learn to work with the restrictions of set text and so on, and they do manage to put together a reasonably interesting course. What happens then is there is the most appalling kind of black hole, which is called GCSE, where there's no progression has been thought through about writing. They're still doing those stupid damn triplets, you know, inform, explain, describe, explore, imagine, entertain. I mean, it's meaningless, you know.
If we have to have an anthology, let's have an electronic one, where children can rewrite the poems in the anthology, they can write their own versions, we have media windows where they can perform them, record themselves performing them. Let's make the curriculum properly interactive. Now that we have the means to do that.
It sounds like inspiration and relevance has been crushed out of the English curriculum at the moment. How can we put it back in for the future?
I suppose this turns on the model that you have of the relationship between this person we call the teacher and this group of people, group of young people we call the class. Whatever range of activities that you come up with, there has to be some notion of partnership, and as the word we have, inspiration, setting fire in some way or another to this group of people. But the teacher herself, himself, must also be inspired in that situation. I remember the most exciting conversation I ever had with a student was at Vauxhall Manor comp years and years ago, where a girl said she never read anything, couldn't see any point, just as you're saying, couldn't see any point in reading, and I talked to her for about 5 minutes and discovered, for example, in her case, that her parents were from Spain, and they'd come over as refugees from the Spanish Civil War, and I just simply said to her, have you ever read anything about Spain and the Spanish Civil War? And she said no, and I said, well, do you know, there's this bloke called Hemingway, and he wrote a bit about that, and I came in with the book, and I know it just sounds like kind of the spark and every kind of teacher's hope, but she did read it, thought it was wonderful, and then said, has this bloke written anything else? That model of finding the door and opening it and setting fire and asking questions that you don't know the answers to, those seem to be at the heart of an inspirational classroom.
As soon as you find what it is that motivates the child, what is their passion, what is their interest, they're suddenly articulate.
I think the problem is that in secondary school, you know, the framework that we work in, the 10 lessons a day or 5 lessons a day, 10 subjects a week, every week, the timetable is actually, that's what we've got to dismantle. I would imagine a GCSE, which is much more like a kind of university course, you know, that you have a week where you do music, you have a week where you do English, then you have a week where you do maths.
I do want to follow this notion about inquiry and about asking questions, and just to share with you a unit of work that I found on the QCA website, and the unit of work is Can Buildings Speak? And I thought, what an interesting question. The problem is that unit of work is in art and design, and I thought, why isn't it in English? Why doesn't English ask those kinds of questions? And to take that kind of approach even to the study of grammar, what do verbs do? What are verbs for? What happens when you use the word I?
You can only mobilise that curiosity if the students don't think that you know the answers to the questions already.
Creativity is tentative, and it needs time, and it needs space, it needs thought.
And the fear of failure must be removed from the activity. You must have a sense of trial and error that of itself is actually worth it.
I think all too often we see creativity as one side of a dichotomy and sort of other things, functional things, literacy or whatever it is, on the other. And I think that's such a shame. I think that for 2015 I'd love us to be seeing that kind of divide broken down.
I've no doubt that English teachers are just as creative and just as inspirational as they've ever been, but they need to be able to flex their wings in a way they can't so easily at the moment, whether it's timetable constraints, whether it's text choice, whether it's assessment regimes, assessment objectives. All these things appear to be constraints.
I hate the thought of children leaving school and going out into that world ignorant of the fact that there's a theatre out there, that there's music out there.
You ask a student what they remember most about their school year, their school career, and it will always be the trip to the theatre, the trip to, you know, the Barbican, or the writer coming in. You know, we don't create... If we did get rid of the sort of shackles of the timetabled GCSE, we could create a kind of fantastically exciting and effective, you know, experience for them.
One balance we've got to try and re-establish between now and 2015 is a better balance between creativity and criticality. There's no doubt that that's a strong theme running through everything we've been saying. But equally, and at the same time, I'm very concerned about the training of teachers to teach creativity and criticality in balance.
It's sort of unlikely that sort of all the contradictions and conflicts over the subject will ever be resolved. And I think that's one of the great sort of strengths of the subject, is that it does encompass quite a kind of plural set of values and ideas, and therefore, in the best of circumstances, leaves scope for teachers to incorporate a whole range of different kinds of experiences and ideas.
In the second part, they discussed the role of English in promoting inclusion in the classroom. They began by talking about cultural literacy.
How would you understand the notion of cultural literacy?
Well, I was concerned that there was enough literature around for children of many diverse backgrounds to be able to say, I relate to that, this could be me. And by being able to do that, that gives them a crucial sense of being valued, having a place in the world, being entitled to have a different background. So I think it's very important for everyone to explore their myth and legend and their roots and their history and their geography.
I think English does that well, actually. In most inner-city classrooms, I mean, the pupils are diverse and their cultures are diverse, and we have plenty of opportunity to give them and look at, you know, diverse texts, at least at Key Stage 3.
I have been in schools where the head teacher or the teacher will say, well, we don't have any minority groups in our school, so it's not an issue for us. Therefore, we don't need to go into it.
The problem is partly in the way that the notion of cultural diversity is framed as being about kind of other people and other cultures. And actually, if you start with the notion of what is your culture and what are the cultures that you inhabit, then that's the place to start. And I mean, it's something I feel, deracinated middle-class white bloke. I don't feel as though I have a cultural heritage, you know, because we never explored that. It's kind of invisible and accepted. And cultural diversity is always about, it seems to be about other people. And starting with the cultures that children inhabit, wherever you are, is probably the best place to start.
And the problem is people don't realise that the diversity is there. So, as you've said, the whole idea is it's framed in terms of that there is an us and an other. And that is, the whole thing has to be reconstructed, but that's a political problem. That's to say there is no other and there is no us. We are all an us, or we are all the other. As Jamila and I once did a radio programme about it, you know, every one of us uses the word pyjamas. Well, we only use the word pyjamas for the simple reason of the roots of this country in the Asian subcontinent. You know, the diversity is there in our mouths every moment that we speak.
What about spoken English?
Yes, well, yes, it's interesting, isn't it, that here we are, we're talking, you know, there's the odd little reference to something written, but we've been going here for quite a while, and then you go out and there's people talking in the tube and so on, and then by and large, the main way in which the spoken word gets into the English classroom is when it's sort of preserved, either in the form of TV or preserved in the form of drama, but we don't actually talk about how it is. We do manage to talk to each other and exchange ideas.
There are actually places for both the assessment and the kind of the doing of speaking and listening. I don't really have a worry with that so much. My worry more is that the confidence of teachers, and particularly inexperienced teachers, to come in and to know how to make sure that the talk kind of happens in a classroom, because that is a very difficult thing to do. You know, you're spinning a lot of plates.
One area I'd like to see really oral work and oral assessment developed is 16 to 19 A-level. I mean, there it really does shut down, and it's a great shame that...
Except they do talk more in the class. Generally what happens is that the means of the learning is almost entirely discussion.
I'm sure that one of the things that we need to do is to look for ways over the next 10 years in which we can genuinely credit students' self-awareness of language and their ability to use it in a variety of ways.
One of the problems is that often children don't consider it to be work. I mean, their fascination with language is endless, and they play with language enormously. And of the people who shift the parameters of what's acceptable language, young people probably do it better than anybody, other than business jargon possibly. But it's not validated within the school, is it? And a very kind of orthodox standard English is the thing that's credited, isn't it, much more?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, there is too much sort of poured into the bag called English, and speaking oracy is kind of 1/3 of it, but we don't really quite know what we're doing with it, or whether it's valuable, or, you know, if we can ignore it, we kind of do. I think that's the problem.
One of the main areas, actually, where English teachers have traditionally felt the least confident is in formal language teaching. What's your view about formal language teaching and its place within the English curriculum? I mean, do you think we're overemphasising the grammatical study?
For a start, it's interesting to know what people mean by grammar. Well, the grammar is the structure of the language, the way that the language is put together. It's syntax and morphology. I mean, I don't think that the majority of people, when they're talking about grammar, mean that. I think they mean sort of punctuation and spelling and so forth.
Well, I was going to say yes. I mean, normally, when you actually break it down what people mean by grammar, they mean virtually just how to make a sentence. And that's it. And that's what they're...
We explode that myth, don't we, that that's what literacy is all about. That literacy is a much more broad set of skills and experiences than that agenda gives credit to.
Us sitting round here, we're doing a whole lot of informal grammar about the way in which we're taking turns and how we take turns, how we're referring to things forwards and backwards. There's an enormous amount of what is in effect a kind of secret grammar going on here. If you were saying, you know, we want to empower kids to go out into the world, and people say, oh, right, well, they better have a sentence. Well, what about being able to, you know, cooperate and run a meeting?
I remember one lesson I had by mistake on grammar turned into looking at the grammar of jokes. Because we were so bored, we actually ended up telling each other jokes, the class and I, and then we found that we could look at the grammar of jokes. I mean, that was really interesting. So there's no shortage, I don't think, of areas of fascinating inquiry. You know, it's almost, the problem is almost the opposite.
Quite often, it's very difficult for English teachers to move away from just solely looking at literature, but also to look at these other uses of language, so you can actually see the difference. And the advantage of I'll stick up for texts here, is the advantage of using the word text is you're saying, look, there are this massive range of utterances, and look, here are the utterances that we call literature, here are the utterances that we call computer games, here are the utterances we call political speech. How are these different?
One of the real dangers for English is that we are actually wanting to put so much into it that it simply physically cannot be covered, either within the curriculum or within education as a whole. And what I think we've really got to try and find for 2015 is a sense of balance here, and that balance is often something which the teacher himself or herself is best placed to work out with their particular class or their particular students.
There does have to be a point where you recognise some kind of gold standard, I would argue, and again, going back to music, it troubles me that somehow by making everything of value, everything okay, that you don't recognise that there is also a craft involved, with a standard involved, and I wouldn't like to see that disappear.
And in music, you actually get better by practising, and you don't even hit theory until sort of grade 5, whatever it is, in that kind of arbitrary kind of way. Whereas in English, there has been this move to saying, I've got to theorise it before I can use it, so you never get the chance to use it, which is kind of giving grammar teaching a bad name.
And as we know, the very best way to learn language is to have the best put in front of you. The best books, the best written books, the best spoken word. And when I say best, there has to be a certain qualitative judgment made.
Do you think we need the grammar of film in the same way?
Teachers are... Because I do quite a lot of work with teachers who are just beginning to introduce film or media teaching, particularly into their English teaching. And that's the first kind of question, the major anxiety, is teach us about the language of film first. And in one sense, you can do that in 15 minutes. You know, it's just a catalogue of camera shots and camera movements. But what's really interesting is grammar in use, it's language in use, it's systems in use. So, and that you do by re-editing material that you've been given that somebody else has shot. That's a nice model to take back into English, into learning about grammar and those kind of systems, by giving kids already, you know, pre-formed language, play with it, use it as building blocks and see how they work when they're put in combination with each other. There's another kind of mode of inquiry, which is to ask about, is there an equivalent of a verb in a film? Is there an equivalent of a noun? Are there similarities between those media and those texts?
What role do you think English teachers themselves are actually going to form in shaping this bright new shiny future? And how can they have more of a role and a voice?
That's interesting, isn't it? Somehow or other there's some incredibly clever boffins sitting in this little office somewhere, I don't even know where it is, called the Department of Education or whatever they keep changing the name to, and that they just fire off these gobbets and rockets, usually kind of weighing about this much, and that all the wisdom would be there, and it would write in these things, research has shown that, in these strange unauthored documents that were thrown at the likes of you, and that is what it is. English teachers don't have an expertise according to these documents.
I think the real trouble now reached a situation which, as you described, is very hierarchical, and at the bottom of the pile is the teacher waiting to be told what to do next. We need a complete reversal of the situation. 25 years ago, increasingly you had a tendency for groups of teachers to construct consortia who then came up with their own proposals for syllabuses, which the examining bodies then validated. It would be good in 10 years' time to have got somewhere back towards that kind of model, because if teachers felt they had an ownership of what they were teaching and how they were going to have their students assessed, I think we get a lot further than we're getting at the moment.
It's certainly true that English teaching has become, and I've been in English teaching for 25 years, it has become increasingly more boring. You know, that there was a sort of flip, that there was a kind of reaction towards providing English teachers with, you know, almost a kind of script from which they could read. There were some good things about that, you know. Lots of people need support in their work, and it did offer that. But it was so extreme and then became sort of taken on in such a wholesale way that I find myself sort of going cross-eyed with boredom, actually.
Well, one of the things is space for continuing professional development of a slightly different kind to the one that's been offered so far. I think that's what we'd want for the future, is a genuine commitment to enough time and space for teachers to really talk about what it is they're wanting to do with their students, not just fulfilling particular objectives that have been handed down.
The more we can get teachers to talk to each other about how they see the subject and ways in which they want the subject to develop, then the more we shall get that kind of informed debate that Barbara was talking about, so that teachers are both reflective in terms of thinking about their subject, but also active in terms of seeing ways forward with it. And that must be good.
If there was just one thing that you could comment that you would like for the future of English, what would that be?
I would want to see English being seen as a subject that belongs to all the pupils, that all pupils see it as being a place where they can develop their creativity and their talents.
Sabrina?
The timetable sent out in a Viking boat and set on fire and pushed out into the North Sea.
Okay.
If everybody could ask the question, who am I, how did I get here, and why do I talk the way I talk?
Okay.
I would like English to be a subject which students enjoyed.
Absolutely. I'd like English to be seen as their rightful tool with which to articulate, communicate, create, be imaginative. It belongs to everybody, it belongs to them.
Mark?
Can I give the kind of school child answer? I think everybody said what I wanted to say. I don't have anything to add to that.